Chapter 1 of the Maxwell Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jennifer Fournier, Sandia Park, New Mexico, USA. The Maxwell Mystery by Carolyn Wells. 1. Concerning Opportunities. Peter King, please. Peter King. Peter King. With a telegram on his tray, the bellboy traversed the crowded hotel dining room, chanting his monotonous refrain, until I managed to make him realize that I owned the above name and persuaded him to hand over the message. It was short and extremely characteristic of the sender. House party. Take afternoon train Saturday. Stay Tuesday. I.G. Phillip Maxwell. I was more than willing to take the designated train, and looked forward with satisfaction to a few days of pleasure. Philip had a decided genius for arranging parties of congenial people, and, moreover, the telegram assured me that at least one of my fellow guests would prove attractive, for the letters I.G. meant nothing more nor less than that Irene Gardner would be there. Though I had met this young woman only twice, she already exerted a fascination over me such as I had never before experienced. As I had hoped, she too went down to Hamilton on the afternoon train, and the 4 hours' journey gave me an opportunity to cultivate her acquaintance more informally than at our previous meetings. This pleased me. And yet, when we were comfortably settled in our chairs and rushing swiftly through the monotonous and uninteresting landscapes of central and southern New Jersey, I was conscious of a certain disappointment regarding my fair companion. In the daylight, and on a railroad train, she lost the subtle charm which perhaps had been imparted by the glamour and artificial light of a ballroom, and she looked older and less ingenuous than I had thought her. And yet she was a beautiful woman. Her clear dark eyes were straightforward without being piercing, nor were they soulful or languishing, but capable of a direct gaze that was both perceptive and responsive. Her clear-cut mouth and chin betokened not only a strong will, but a strong character and a capable nature. No, seen by daylight there was no glamour about Irene Gardner, but the very lack of it, where I had expected to find it, interested me. She was entirely at her ease as we pursued our journey, and with a ready, graceful tact adapted herself to the exigencies of the situation. Perhaps it would be more nearly true of Irene Gardner to say that she adapted situations to herself. Without seeming to dictate, she anticipated my wishes, and made just such suggestions as I wished to carry out. Within an hour of our leaving New York, I found myself enjoying a cigar in the smoker, and wondered how I had managed it. When I realized that I had come there at her advice and even insistence, I gave her immediate credit for tactful cleverness, woman's most admirable trait. Yet, somehow, I felt a certain chagrin. To be sure, I did want to smoke, but I didn't want to be made to smoke, and to obey the suggestion unconsciously at that. There was no one in the smoker that I knew, and after I had finished my cigar, I began to feel a strong inclination to return to Miss Gardner's society, and with a sudden intuition, I felt sure that this was just the result she had intended to bring about, and that she had dismissed me in order that we might not both become bored with a long and uninterrupted tete-a-tete. This very thought determined me not to go back. But such is the perversity of the human will, that the more I stayed away, the more I felt inclined to go. So, half angry at myself, I returned to my chair in the parlor car, and was greeted by a bright smile of welcome. "I've been reading a detective story," she said, as she turned down a leaf and closed the paper-covered book she held. I don't often affect that style of literature, but the train boy seemed of the opinion that this book was the brightest gem of modern fiction, and that no self-respecting citizen could afford to let it go unread. "Don't scorn detective fiction as a class," I begged. "It's one of my favorite lines of light reading. I have read that book, and though its literary style is open to criticism, it advances a strong and tenable theory of crime." "I haven't finished the story," said Miss Gardner, "but I suppose you mean the idea that innocence is only the absence of temptation?" That is perhaps putting it a little too strongly, but I certainly think that often opportunity creates a sinner." "It is not a new idea," said Miss Gardner thoughtfully. "I believe Goethe said, 'We are all capable of crime, even the best of us.' And while he would doubtless have admitted exceptions to his rule, he must have thought it applicable to the great majority." "It's impossible to tell," I observed, "for though we often know when a man succumbs to temptation, we cannot know how often he resists it." "But we can know ourselves," exclaimed Miss Gardner with a sudden energy. "Honestly now, if the motive were sufficient and a perfect opportunity presented itself unsought, could you imagine yourself committing a great crime?" "Oh, I have a vivid imagination," I replied gaily, "and it isn't the least trouble to imagine myself cracking a safe or kidnapping a king. But when it came to the point, I doubt if I'd do it after all. I'd be afraid of the consequences." "Now you're flippant, but I'm very much in earnest. I really believe if the motive were strong enough, I mean if it were one of the elemental motives, like love, jealousy, or revenge, I could kill a human being without hesitation. Of course, it would be in a moment of frenzy, and I would doubtless regret it afterward, and even wonder at my own deed. But the point I'm trying to make is only that, in proportion to the passions of which we are capable, we possess an equivalent capability of executing the natural consequences of those passions." I looked at Miss Gardner curiously. She certainly was in earnest, yet she gave me the impression of a theorist rather than one speaking from personal conviction. And, too, it shocked me. She couldn't mean it, and yet the positiveness of her speech and the earnestness of her look indicated sincerity. With her animated dark beauty, she looked just then like Judith and Jael and Zenobia all in one. It was not at all difficult at that moment to imagine her giving way to an elemental emotion, but the thought was far from pleasant, and I put it quickly away from me. "Let us leave ourselves out of the question," I said, "and merely admit that crimes have been committed by persons innocent up to the moment when strong temptation and opportunity were present at the same time." "You will not be serious," she retorted, "so we'll drop the subject. And now, unless you make yourself very entertaining, I'll return to my storybook and leave you to your own devices." "That would be a crime, and you would commit it because you see your opportunity," I replied, whereupon Miss Gardner laughed gaily and abandoned her discussion of serious theories. I must have proved sufficiently entertaining, for she did not reopen her novel, and we chatted pleasantly during the rest of the journey. "Is it a large and a gay party we're traveling toward?" I asked as we neared Hamilton. "I don't really know," said Miss Gardner. "Miss Maxwell invited me, and the only other guests she mentioned in her letter, beside yourself, were Mildred Leslie and the Whitings." "You mean Mildred's sister Edith and her husband?" "Yes. You know Edith married Tom Whiting. He's a most delightful man, and the Leslies are dear girls." "I remember Edith as a beauty, but I haven't seen Mildred since she was a youngster." "Prepare yourself for a surprise, then. She's grown up to be the most fascinating little witch you ever saw." "At any rate, Philip thinks so," I said, smiling, and Miss Gardner returned an understanding glance. "Yes," she agreed. "Philip is perfectly daft about her, but I don't think Miss Maxwell is altogether pleased at that. She's awfully fond of Mildred, but I think she would rather Philip should choose a different type for a wife." "But I doubt if Philip will ask his aunt's advice in such a matter." "Indeed he won't, nor his uncle's either. Phil's a dear fellow, but those two old people have spoiled him by humoring him too much, and now they can't be surprised if he insists upon his own way." "Do you approve the match?" I asked rather pointedly. "No, I can't. Milly is a perfect darling, but she would lead Philip a dance all his life. She's a born coquette, and she can't help flirting with everybody." "She may try it with me if she likes," I said nonchalantly, and Miss Gardner responded, "Have no doubts of that. She's bound to do so. I only wish you would involve her, or let her involve you in so deep a flirtation that Philip would lose his interest." "My dear Miss Gardner, don't you know that would be just the way to pique Philip's interests and defeat your own very admirable intent?" "I suppose it would," said Irene with a little sigh, and then our train drew into the Hamilton station. Philip met us at the train with his automobile. "I say, but you're late," he shouted. "We've been waiting 20 minutes." He led the way to his big touring car, as shinily spick and span as a steam yacht, and bundled us into it. "You sit back, Peter," he directed, "with Mrs. Whiting and Miss Leslie, and I'll take Miss Gardner with me. We'll run around the country a bit before we go home." I hadn't seen Mildred Leslie for several years, and I was all unprepared for the change which had transformed the shy schoolgirl into one of the most beautiful women I had ever seen. She was of the apple blossom type, and her frivolous dimpled face was adorably pink and white, with big pansy blue eyes and a saucy curved mouth. A riotous fluff of golden hair escaped from her automobile veil, and the first glance proved the girl to be a coquette to her fingertips. Her sister, Mrs. Whiting, was totally unlike her. She was a solid, sensible little woman, whose sole occupation in life seemed to be a protracted, futile attempt to keep Mildred in order. I took my seat between these two ladies, feeling that, for the next few days at least, my lines had fallen in pleasant places. "I do love a house party at the Maxwells," said Mildred, "because the party never stays in the house. There are so many lovely outdoorsy things to do that if it weren't for meals, we'd never see the inside of the beautiful old mansion." "It is a beautiful house," said Mrs. Whiting. "I almost wish it would rain tomorrow so that we might stay in and enjoy it." "Oh, Edith, not tomorrow," cried Mildred. "We've too many things planned. Why, Mr. King, there's a different picnic arranged for every hour in the day, and you can pick out whichever ones you like best to go to." "I've such faith in your taste," I replied, "that I'll just follow you and go to the ones you attend." "I'm going to send regrets to several of the picnics," announced Irene Gardner, "and ramble around the house. I've never seen it, but I've often heard of its glories." "We must stay indoors long enough to have some music," said Mrs. Whiting. "I want to hear Irene sing some of her old songs again." "I cannot sing the old songs," Irene said, laughing, "but I know a lot of new ones." "I'll stay home from any picnic to hear them," said Mildred promptly. "I'll stay too," said I. But though this sounded as if a compliment to Miss Gardner's music, a flash of appreciation from Mildred's blue eyes proved to me that she read my intent. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of the Maxwell Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jennifer Fournier, Sandia Park, New Mexico, USA. The Maxwell Mystery by Carolyn Wells. 2. Maxwell Chimneys. "Oh, how stunning!" cried Irene Gardner, for just then we whizzed up the driveway to the Maxwell house, and though perhaps not the word a purist would have chosen, stunning did seem to express the effect. The white pillars and porticos of the mansion gleamed through the evergreen trees that dotted the broad lawn. The sunset in progress was of the spectacular variety, and a nearby lake reflected its gorgeous colorings. Alexander Maxwell had chosen to call his beautiful home Maxwell Chimneys, and the place was as picturesque and unusual as its name. It had chimneys of the reddest of red brick, and these stuck up all over the roof of the many-gabled house, and also ran up the sides and down the back and nestled in corners, and even presented the novel spectacle of a fireplace right out on the broad front veranda. Though Philip had laughed at this addition to the heating facilities of the mansion, it proved to be a great success, and on cool summer evenings the open fire lit up the atmosphere gaily, and, incidentally, warmed a small portion of it. The truth was, Miss Maxwell did not herself like outdoor life, so by filling her home with cozy fireplaces, she often enticed her guests indoors, which thoroughly pleased her hospitable soul. For the great house was always filled with guests, and one house party followed close on the heels of another all summer long. Maxwell Chimneys occupied one of the most desirable locations in Fairmountain Park, and the views from its various windows and balconies were like a series of illuminated postcards. Or at least that was the remark made by 7 out of every 10 of the guests who visited there. As we neared the veranda, a cheery voice shouted, "Hello!" and Tom Whiting ran down the steps to meet us. The big, good-natured chap was a general favorite, and I cordially returned his hearty greeting. Then the wide front door swung open, and the old doorway made a fitting frame for the gentle lady of the house who stood within it. Miss Miranda Maxwell was Philip's aunt, and incidentally was his devoted slave. She and her brother Alexander had lived in the old house for many years, beloved and respected by the townspeople of Hamilton, though deemed perhaps a shade too quiet an old fogey for the rising generation. But this was all changed when their nephew Philip came to live with them, and filled the house with young life and new interests. He had been there about 3 years now, and though the village gossips had concluded that he would never make the gentleman of the old school that his uncle was, yet he had won his own place in their regard, and his gay, sunny nature had gained many friends for him. Phil was a good-looking chap of about 23, and had been an orphan since childhood. After his school and college days, his uncle had invited him to make his permanent home at Maxwell Chimneys, and Philip had accepted the invitation. It was generally understood that he would eventually inherit the place, together with Alexander Maxwell's large fortune, and though not avaricious, Philip looked forward complacently to a life of ease and luxury. So far as social life went, he was practically master of Maxwell Chimneys. He invited guests whenever he chose and entertained them elaborately. Though Mr. Maxwell joined but seldom in the young people's festivities, he paid the bills without a murmur and smiled indulgently at his merry-hearted nephew. I had known Philip all through our college days, and I had made long and frequent visits at Maxwell Chimneys, where the hours of quiet enjoyment were often varied by delightful impromptu entertainments, the product of Philip's ingenuity. I was a favorite with both the old people, and I fully returned their regard. Mr. Maxwell was a collector in a modest way, and I was always gratified when I could assist him in his quest or researches. Miss Maxwell had such a kind, motherly heart that I think she was a friend to everybody. But she, too, seemed specially to like me, and so my visits to Hamilton were always pleasant occasions. "How do you do, Peter? I'm very glad to see you," she said, so cordially that the warm welcome of her tone made the commonplace salutation a heartfelt one. "How do you do, Miss Miranda?" I responded with equal cordiality. "I'm most happy to be here again. It is a long time since I've enjoyed your hospitality. Ah, here is Mr. Maxwell. How do you do, sir?" I raised my voice to speak to my elderly host, for I remembered his deafness. He shook hands and greeted me warmly, expressing his pleasure that I was with them once again. I counted this brother and sister among my best friends, and aside from their kindness and hospitality, they represented the best type of our American people. Educated, cultured, and refined, they imbued their home with an atmosphere of pleasantest good humor. The house was luxurious, and their manner of living, though rather elaborate, was not formal and not uncomfortably conventional. Miss Maxwell herself showed me to my room, and as she left me at the door, she gave a motherly little pat to my shoulder, saying, "Now, Peter, dear boy, Philip's man will look after you, but if everything isn't just to your liking, let me know, won't you?" "Sure he will, Aunt Miranda," broke in Philip's gay voice as he passed us in the hall. "Look alive now, Peter, old boy, and tog yourself for dinner at once, and drop down to the terrace as soon as you're ready." But after I was dressed, I stepped out onto the balcony through my own window, lured by the beauty of the scene before me. The distant hills were purple in the late twilight, and the crisp air of early autumn was pleasant after the warmth of the house. I stood at the balcony rail, and as I looked down, I saw 2 people strolling along the terrace just beneath me. In the dusk, I was uncertain who they were, and then I heard Philip's clear, deep voice. "You're a rattle-brained, butterfly-minded, and extremely conceited young person," he declared. "But I have the misfortune to love you as I love life itself. So, once more, Mildred, darling, won't you marry me?" Mildred laughed. "Philip," she said, "I do believe that's the 1,000th time you've asked me that question. Please don't do it again. My answer is no." "Milly," and Philip's voice took on a new tone. "I shall ask you that question just once more. Not now, and only once more. Remember, dear, only once. Come, let us go back to the house." I felt no compunction at my involuntary eavesdropping, for these people were speaking in casual tones, and anyone on the verandas might have overheard them. And too, what they said was no secret. Miss Gardner had told me that Philip wanted to marry Mildred, and I felt sure that the laughing reply she had given him was merely coquetry, and that he would again ask her the same question, and get another answer. I went downstairs and met the pair just entering the house, and then we went in to dinner. Later on, as was the custom at Maxwell Chimneys, we all gathered on the front veranda to watch the moonrise. Now, moonrise over Fair Mountain was of the nature of a solemn function, and by no means to be lightly treated. The feminine members of the party, therefore, had selected their places with a view to their own picturesque effect in connection with the view, and the men naturally fell into position near the women they most admired. This, of course, meant that Philip Maxwell should establish himself in the near vicinity of Mildred Leslie. But the young man had learned by experience that Mildred's nature was possessed of a certain butterfly quality that often caused her to hover about from one place to another before settling on a final choice. And as he could not, with dignity, jump up and run about after her, he wisely paused and stood carelessly leaning against a pillar, watching her as she fluttered about. The young man had certainly shown no error in taste in admiring Mildred. She was, without doubt, the prettiest girl present, and prettier than any girl one would meet in many a long summer day. Her piquant, merry little face was always smiling, and her deep blue eyes seemed to be full of half-hidden sunshine. Her hair was just on the darker side of golden, and, owing to a bewitching waviness, seemed to look prettier every new way she arranged it. Mildred was not quite 20, and had not outgrown a certain childish willfulness that was inherent in her nature. But though sometimes provokingly saucy, she was so winsomely attractive that her friends declared her adorable, in spite of the fact that she was a spoiled child. Philip's devotion to her was an open secret, and though there were others whose devotion was equally evident, the somewhat strong-willed young man had determined to win her, and of late had felt that he might consider his case hopeful. In her dainty white evening gown, befrilled with fluffy laces, Mildred was a picture as she flitted about from one group to another, the filmy blue scarf trailing around her, never in place but always picturesque. "Dear Miss Maxwell," she said, pausing a moment by her hostess's chair, "mayn't we have a picnic to Heatherwood some day soon?" "Oh, do let us," chimed in Irene Gardner. "A real old-fashioned picnic with deviled eggs and lemon pie." "My dear girls," replied Miss Maxwell, "you may have a picnic at Land's End if you choose, provided you don't ask me to go to it." For though Miss Miranda wanted young people about her, she didn't fancy running around much. "Dear old dearie," said Mildred, patting her shoulder, "she shall stay at home if she wants to, and toast her toes at her own fireside, so she shall. Edith, you'll chaperone us, won't you?" she asked of the young matron of the party. "I'll be chaperone in name only," said Mrs. Whiting, laughing. "But as to exercising any real authority over you rollicking creatures, I shouldn't like to promise it." "Now, Mrs. Whiting," exclaimed Irene, "that's too bad. Millie, we all know, is difficult, but I'm as good as gold. At least, I have my good days. They're Tuesdays and Sundays this summer, and as tomorrow is Sunday, you needn't worry at all about me." "That's a lovely plan of yours," said Mildred, "to have days on which to be good. I wish I had one. I think one would be enough for me." "You?" exclaimed Gilbert Crane, a neighbor who had strolled over. "You'd have to choose Tibbs' Eve or the 31st of February." "How delightfully rude you are," said Mildred, her dimples deepening as she slowly drawled out the words at him. Then, as if it were an afterthought, "I love rude men." "It's nice of you to put it that way," he responded. "And as a reward, I'll take you for a walk. Come on, we'll go and hunt up that moon. I don't believe it's ever going to rise over that mountain. Must have slipped a cog or something." "Thank you so much," said Mildred, settling herself complacently in a rustic chair beside Miss Maxwell. "But I'm not going out this evening." "Oh, yes, you are," declared Crane in a gaily commanding tone. "Just gather up that undecided blue wrap that seems to be detaching itself from your personality and come along with me." "Observe me go," said Mildred calmly, as she sat motionless in her big rattan easy-chair. Gilbert Crane laughed and sat down beside her, and began to chat in low tones, paying no attention to Philip's haughty look. Presently their attention was arrested by what Miss Maxwell was saying. "Yes, he's coming tomorrow," declared that lady, with a note of triumph in her voice. She had been reading a telegram which a servant had just brought her, and as she folded it away, Mildred asked, "Who is coming tomorrow?" "Clarence, Earl of Clarendon," was the proud reply. "Goodness, what a name! He ought to have it dramatized. But I suppose we can call him Claire or Clary. Is he a real live earl? And what's he coming for?" "Yes, indeed, he's real," said Miss Maxwell in reply to the first question. "I was so afraid he wouldn't come that I didn't tell you I had asked him. But he is coming, and all you girls must make yourselves particularly charming and give him a good time. His people were perfectly lovely to us in England, so we must reciprocate. He'll be here in time for your picnic, Milly." "He won't like me," said Mildred pensively. "I'm too stars and stripesy to please an English earl. He'll succumb to Irene's statuesque charm and Vere de Varienne repose of manner. Yes, of course, Clarence will think Irene the gem of this collection," agreed Edith Whiting. "But let's put up a brave fight, Milly. If we can't charm the belted gentleman, let's at least impress him with our free-born Americanism. We can attract his attention in some way, unless he's hunting an heiress." "Why are earls always belted?" asked Mildred, drowning Miss Maxwell's protest at Edith's last words. "They deserve to be belted for coming over here and bothering our girls," said Philip. "I shan't bother with him," declared Mildred. "United States boys are good enough for me." And she cast an approving glance at the good-looking young American men standing about. "That's all very well," said Gilbert Crane, "and I hope you won't bother with his earlship. But I say, Milly, if you cast those big blue soup plates of eyes of yours at him, I shouldn't like to answer for the consequences. You know English girls stare. They don't dart fascinating glances through a regular Niagara Falls of eyelashes, and I prophesy that his belted highness won't know where he's at when you've smiled at him a few." "Nonsense," said Mildred. "He won't give me a chance to look at him. Those English grandees are awfully stuck up, and they only come to quiz us and write us up. What does he look like, Miss Miranda? I suppose, as Lord Fauntleroy says, he doesn't wear his coronet all the time." "I won't tell you anything more about him," rejoined Miss Maxwell decidedly. "It isn't fair for you to know about him when he doesn't know anything about you. I think," said Tom Whiting, "I shall draw up a sort of descriptive catalogue of you girls and nail it on the inside of his door. It will save him lots of trouble. Something like this, you know. Miss Irene Gardner, raving beauty of the Burne-Jones type. Classic features, amiable disposition, great tennis player, and all-round athlete." "There's no use going any further than Irene," interrupted Edith with a disheartened sigh. "After that description, Clarence won't read any more." "Wait and see," said her husband laughingly. "Next we have Mrs. Whiting, a perfect blonde of the peaches and cream variety, sings like an angel, and plays the mandolin to beat the band." "That ought to charm any old earl," declared Crane. "Now hit off Milly, though no mere words can do her justice." "Ah, there's the rub," exclaimed Tom. "If anyone can describe Mildred Leslie, they're welcome to do it. I can't." "I'll try," said Crane, "and if my descriptive powers give out, somebody else can take up the tale. To begin with, I should say Miss Mildred Leslie is a mischievous, roguish, saucy, adorable bit of humanity who flirts with everybody within hailing distance." "I don't," put in Milly, making a moue. You do, asserted Philip. Go on, Gilbert. A willful, perverse, spoiled child who always has her own way. Because everybody is so good to her, interrupted Milly again. Because everybody loves her, said Miss Maxwell, looking affectionately at the young girl, at which Mildred kissed that lady's hand and suddenly jumped up and ran away. Later, when their hostess declared it was growing chilly and they would go indoors and have some music, Philip came upon Milly and myself in a vine-draped corner of the veranda. "See here, Milly," he said, "you're not to let that foreign popinjay tie himself to your apron strings." "Oh, do you suppose that's what he is coming over here for?" asked the girl, dropping her voice to an awestruck tone. "If you weren't you, Milly, I should say you were a goose." And Philip's tone actually sounded vexed. Mildred's manner became coldly dignified, but her eyes gleamed as she said, "Why, that's what I wanted to say to you." At that, Philip laughed genially. "Then let me beg you again, not to let the Britisher tie himself up with any of your danglers." "I certainly shan't ask him to," said Mildred carelessly, "but if he sees fit to tie himself, I can't help it. And you must admit, Phil, it would be a novel experience to have a real earl at my beck and call. Oh, I'd love to be proposed to by a nobleman. How do you suppose they do it, Philip?" "You ought to know all there is to know about how men propose. You've been through it often enough." "Yes, but it's almost always you know." "I only wish that were true." "Well, it is, almost," Mildred sighed. "But anyway, I like you better than most of the others. You're a lot nicer than Gilbert Crane, for instance." "Well, I am glad you think so." And Philip squared his shoulders with an unconscious air of superiority. "You needn't act so conceited over it," Mildred exclaimed. "Of course, you're big and handsome, and he's insignificant-looking, but he can't help that, and you oughtn't to be vain." Philip tried to look modest and self-depreciatory, but only succeeded in achieving a satisfied grin, whereat we all laughed. "But you know," Mildred went on, "it isn't everything to be big and handsome and rich as you are, and if I promised to marry you, I might afterwards see someone I liked better." "An earl, perhaps?" said Philip, not noticing me, but looking at her steadily. "Yes," said Mildred, returning his look with an unflinching gaze. "An earl, perhaps." "Well," said Philip, giving her a curious look, "you might do worse." "Indeed I might," she responded a little curtly. "Very much worse." And, laughing a little at their foolish banter, I left them and went into the house. End of chapter 2.